Hi everyone, welcome to Module 2 of Intro to Media. And in this module, we'll be asking the question, what are modern media? We'll attempt to define some of the terms that are used in this class, and we'll also consider the extent to which we have to change our definitions, how we have to adapt the way we conceive of audiences, the way we even define what a medium is. So I'll be drawing in part from Chapter 13, Media Economics and the Global Marketplace. If you don't have the most recent edition of Media and Culture, then these pages may not mean anything to you, but I want you to read about the first two-thirds of the chapter. So the textbook defines mass communication in a particular way. The authors say that mass communication is the process of designing cultural messages and stories and delivering them to large and diverse audiences. So there are a few assumptions that the authors are making in defining mass communication this way. One is that people are receiving content simultaneously. That is, that they're sharing these cultural messages and stories in approximately the same time and space. So that when we think about exposure, we think about these large and diverse audiences receiving that information in similar ways, through shared platforms, through shared exposure, through shared time and space. And this, I think, was really relevant when broadcast television and broadcast radio meant that people could only consume television shows or radio programs at the same time, at the time that they were broadcast. But of course, a lot has changed. We don't have as many media events as we once did prior to the advent of kind of on-demand media exposure. In the 1990s, Elihu Katz and Danielle Dayan came up with this notion of media events, and these were live broadcasts of what would later become historic events that are in many ways ritualistic for the world and that have the potential for really transforming societies even as they are transfixing viewers or listeners around the globe. So what kind of events could we identify as these live broadcasts of historic events? Not so many in recent years, but just even in the last couple of decades, we can identify some. One, I think, good example is weddings of royalty, for example. Olympics are other media events that tend to transfix the world. Funerals of highly visible politicians, for example, and of course way back when in the 1960s, moon landings were covered as live broadcasts. They were definitely media events. In modern days, we might see more mass consumption of, for example, a television show. If there's a finale of a very popular program, HBO's Game of Thrones is one of the most recent examples of that. Not being a Game of Thrones viewer, I didn't participate in that shared experience, but I do know, given all that was written about it, that it was an event. As I mentioned, the Olympics, every 2 to 4 years. One of the biggest worldwide events that was watched simultaneously around the world was the wedding of Prince Charles and Lady Diana. And more recently, the earthquake and tsunami in Japan was one shared experience that many of us were watching together simultaneously, in part because of stations like CNN. 9/11. Many of you weren't born yet. Many of you didn't experience this. But things were different 18, 20 years ago. The media landscape was very different, and therefore the way we participate collectively in an event that is as historic and as society changing as 9/11 is really different than some of the more recent media events that we've experienced together, like the tsunami or hurricanes or, of course, a pandemic. What was different 2 decades ago? Well, 9/11 was the first global catastrophe that was experienced in real time by hundreds of millions of people around the world. One research team out of the University of Georgia write that as many as 2 billion people either watched the attacks in real time or watched the day's news about it on the day that it happened. CNN had a live feed trained on the Twin Towers at 8:49. They got that camera up there and trained on the towers just 3 minutes after the first plane hit. And therefore, you might be asking, well, why did people watch CNN? Why weren't they on the internet? Why weren't they uploading their own images? Why weren't they communicating with each other that way? Well, many of the news websites in 2001 didn't have the capacity to deal with the very, very heavy traffic loads that burdened them. And therefore, servers kept crashing and people really couldn't get on the web. And people had very few alternative sources of information. We can even think about President Bush's plane at the time. It had no satellite. It had no cable TV. It had no access to email. On the ground, cell phones didn't work. People were turning to payphones. And of course, these were the days before cell phones even had cameras. And if we think about how it would be different today, certainly we could use social media to try to check in on our friends and family. People are more and more using the safety check-in. We would probably see a lot more commentary around what people thought was happening around the planes crashing into the towers and into the Pentagon. Today, of course, there's much greater partisan television coverage. So a channel like Fox would be covering 9/11 very differently than a channel like MSNBC. And certainly people today have much more capacity to be able to post their own videos, their own photos of events, and tell their own story the way they saw it. So instead of really thinking about mass communication in the modern era, I think we need to be talking about mediated communication, in part because communication from various media outlets or industries is no longer as one way or even as mass as it used to be. It doesn't have quite the same goal of reaching the largest possible audience with the lowest common denominator. But communication is still passing through media platforms and being filtered and refracted through the experiences of audiences. Let me ask you this question and see if you can answer it. How much time did you spend watching television yesterday? You might have a pretty clear picture in your mind. You might say, look, I don't know, but you might also think, all right, I watched a show that was about a half an hour, and you can kind of build it up from there. But you might also have some questions. For example, this was my television viewing yesterday. My latest TV obsession is Better Things on Hulu. And what's challenging for me about answering that question, how much time did you spend watching television yesterday, is this. So Better Things is a television show. It was on FX, but I'm watching it on Hulu, but I'm also not watching it on a television set. So I was watching on an iPad. So if you watch something, consume a program on a platform other than television, is that watching television? You might also say to yourself, well, you're watching an FX show, but you're watching it through a streaming service. I was watching it through Hulu. So does that count as television? It gets pretty tricky. And for media scholars like myself who are trying to do things like measure the amount of time that people might be spending with a medium in order to estimate exposure, it's really, really tricky unless you lay down definitions for what is television viewing. What this reflects then is the increasing convergence of multiple media platforms into single kinds of channels. So we have, for example, magazine articles and radio programs and TV shows and video games all now available on the internet, and they reach us through a variety of platforms, from laptops to tablets to smartphones. This is a business model that has involved consolidating a lot of different kinds of media holdings. So what used to be a cable channel alone, let's say Comcast in Philadelphia, now is also a cable channel and a telephone delivery system. And they have also gotten into the business of partnering up with or acquiring TV stations. So Comcast became NBC Universal. And this is all under one corporate umbrella, as we read about in Chapter 13. So it also becomes challenging not only to understand how audiences are spending time with media, but also how media gets produced, and understanding the kinds of constraints that come along with convergence onto a single platform like the internet. So it's complicated, right? Having convergence, living within convergence culture has complicated the ways in which audiences are consuming content, but it's also reflecting and shaping this very complicated economic structure of media industries. So I want to just walk you through a couple of different kinds of structures and what they reflect about the medium that they represent, but also what they reflect about competition. I have in the module a link to a TED Talk with the Netflix CEO. I think it's a very interesting story. You read about it a little bit in your textbook, but it's an important story. After you look at that, I think it's about a 15-minute interview, ask yourself a number of questions that are related to this Netflix story. Specifically, why is it such an important story to tell? To give you the broad brushstrokes, this is a company that was founded to be just an online movie rental company. So movies were able to be rented. One had to go to the local neighborhood Blockbuster and take out the VHS and bring it home and play it on your machine. And Netflix stepped in and said, we have a better way. We're going to mail out DVDs, and people can save a trip to their local Blockbuster, and then they can have a queue of DVDs waiting. So as they finish one, they return it, they get the next one. And that was their model for 10 years. They developed streaming as a practice in 2007. And they expanded very quickly from being a US-only company to going into global markets around the world just 3 years later. And then 3 years after that, they began producing their own programs. They weren't any longer satisfied with just acquiring other people's programs and kind of streaming them or sending them out. It's an interesting model to take over all pieces of that chain, right? From the delivery system to the production system. So that by just a couple of years ago, they had generated $6.8 billion in annual revenue. That's mind-blowing for a company that is, has evolved so rapidly as Netflix. They have 130 million streaming members in over 190 countries, enjoying more than 140 million hours of TV shows and movies per day. In the TED Talk, the interviewer asks the CEO about this practice that they've allowed of people sharing their passwords and having multiple people on one account. It was kind of confusing for them at first because they weren't able to really build appropriate algorithms to suggest what kinds of movies or TV shows the audience member would be suggested to watch. And so when they came up with a strategy for saying you can have, give this out to multiple people, but, identify who you are when you're watching it, that helped a bit. But I'm guessing that many of you are in accounts that have many, many people. And yeah, it's interesting to see what they're watching and what Netflix is suggesting to them as well. So think about these considerations after you watch that interview, the TED Talk interview. Would you say that Netflix has changed TV culture? This is something that's addressed as well in the book. And how has it changed TV culture? What have been the keys to Netflix's success, according to that interview? And do you see any downsides to their success? It's not all, rainbows and unicorns. There have been some challenges that Netflix has presented as a global media company that not only acquires content but also makes its own. Media industry structures are important to understand to get a handle on the kinds of competition or lack of competition that face various media platforms. Certainly one is the monopoly, and in monopoly ownership, it's one company that's really dominating production and distribution. An example of a monopoly is in Philadelphia, there is one newspaper holding company that publishes in 3 different outlets. So the one company produces the Inquirer, the Philadelphia Daily News, and then they have an online news presence, Philly.com. And you may say, well, why don't other newspapers come in and offer alternative kinds of news or readings? And the answer is that the market can't support it. In fact, Philadelphia lost one of its most important publications about 15 years ago because there was just not enough market for 2 separate news outlets. And there may not even be a market for one local newspaper, even in a city as large as 1.5 million. So again, it's not unusual for a city to have just one newspaper, but that newspaper can't also be a part of other media companies within that same city. And so the folks that own the Inquirer cannot also own the local ABC station. There was also it was also the case for a while that cable companies were monopolistic. And the reason why was because the cable companies would come into cities in the 1980s and they would lay the wire or lay the cable. And they didn't want to invest in that kind of infrastructure if they were going to have competition. It really wasn't until there was an alternative to cable, that is satellite, that the monopoly hold of these cable companies was loosened. Another type of media structure is the oligopoly. And with oligopolies, there are a few firms, but they tend to dominate those industries. So an example is music. So there are really 3 major music conglomerates that control the vast majority of music production and distribution around the world. In this case, with music, it's Sony, Universal, and Warner. And then another model is limited competition, right? So you've got monopolistic competition where there are only a certain number of licenses that can be given to broadcast television. We have a spectrum that is it's gotten bigger than it had been previously when there was only analog television. Now there's also digital television. But broadcasters receive licenses from the Federal Communications Commission, in part because if there were too many people trying to jump onto the nation's airwaves, it would cause a lot of confusion. And we'll talk about how that happened in the early days of radio and also television. But most of the media companies have gotten away from being accused of having monopolies by having diverse types of media rather than just trying to control one medium. So you won't have a conglomerate that only has radio stations. It will have radio stations and TV stations and newspapers maybe, and magazines and movie studios. So rather than having cornering the market on cable or television or radio or newspapers, instead a company will have multiple media under their one corporate umbrella. The Telecommunications Act of 1996, which we'll come back to when we talk about media policy, says that one single company can own almost an unlimited number of radio and TV stations, and that telephone companies can also own TV and radio stations. As well, cable companies can compete in local telephone, and they can also now freely raise rates. But what a company cannot do is own within one market radio and television and cable. They would have to own multiple outlets across the country. The case of Warner Media is an interesting one, and the textbook authors go into it in detail. In essence, what Warner Media has are both lots of inventory, right? Television shows from TBS or Turner Classic Movies. They have production, right? So HBO and Cinemax, they'll create their own content, but they also will acquire other content, including content from other Warner Media outlets. They have a news programming station, CNN. They have sports programming. They own many movie studios, but then they also own those websites where people will read reviews of movies. They are into comic books. They are into theme parks, and it's just a massive, massive company. In the textbook, they talk about how, in kind of the old way of media production and distribution, there would be separately content companies like studios that made stuff like TV shows and movies, and then they would sell that content to distributors like HBO or Netflix, who then sold it to consumers. But of course, a new way is that Netflix is buying stuff from studios, but it's also making its own stuff and selling it directly to consumers. And so some of the older media companies, the way they ultimately competed was by consolidating. So Disney purchases Fox, AT&T buys Time Warner buys HBO. Similarly, with the tech companies, Google, Amazon, Apple, while they used to only be platforms, now they are also content creators. In the textbook, the authors ask whether or not Google is a monopoly. And I think this is an important and interesting question to ask, because within Google, there have been kind of aggressive policies to try to control the kind of flow, dissemination of user information. And at one point, the attorneys general for 50 states and U.S. territories announced that they were going to investigate whether or not they were breaking antitrust rules. And so they had to ask several important questions. Does the company threaten competition? Does the company dominate all aspects of advertising, in this case on the internet? Does it dominate searching? Of course, it's become its own verb, right? I'll Google that. Within the last 3 or 4 years, European regulators have argued that Google is breaking all kinds of antitrust rules that are relevant to the EU, and they have issued the company billions of dollars in fines to try to get them to stop doing some of the above listed activities. And of course now Facebook is under scrutiny for violating competition laws, and of course they are always under the microscope for mishandling consumers' private personal information. So if we think about the upsides and the downsides of doing business in ways that involve these kind of mega conglomerates that are not only, U.S. based, but also are really global entities. Certainly an upside is that more outlets mean more options, right? We've been in the middle of a pandemic for months and months and months and months, and we haven't run out of things to watch. So we have a lot of options through our various streaming services, but also we have a lot of outlets for searching for options, for customizing the content that we access. More outlets can mean more synergy for these companies. So if you own a movie production company and you also own that website that produces reviews of movies, you won't necessarily affect those reviews, but you will at least have people talking about your movie. Warner, for example, owns Entertainment Weekly, and so many of the things that make it onto the cover of Entertainment Weekly are Warner-owned properties. So that's what we mean by synergy. If you have content in one area, you can promote it in another area, and both of those areas benefit from being in business together. One might also say that if you have more outlets, then you have more flexibility and you have more creativity. And we certainly saw that in the TED Talk discussion with the Netflix CEO, who said, we aren't answerable to anyone. We're cultivating our own audience. We don't have to report ratings to advertisers. And that means we can get really creative. And so they make a lot of content. They kind of throw it at the wall to see what sticks, and 75% of it does not stick, and that's expensive. But the 25% that does tends to be wildly successful. But there are some downsides as well. So consolidation has meant that the number of people who can participate in the industry has shrunk, because if you have companies acquiring one another, then management gets redundant, and so you don't need two CEOs, you just have one CEO. We also see that those who are in power hold on to power, and we'll talk about what we mean by hegemony. And globalization, in the context of these major media conglomerates, can often mean westernization, and westernization often leads to cultural imperialism. So let's define those concepts. Hegemony is that process by which certain values and ways of thought get promulgated through the mass media, and those ways of thought that are further explored by mass media end up becoming dominant in that society. In the context of talking about Western media, we have seen in particular conversations about how hegemony by U.S. or Western media reinforces particular kinds of economic systems, for example, a capitalist system. So if you think about the advertising model of getting content to people, the idea of creating shows and distributing them is really to get eyeballs in front of those shows. And who are those eyeballs for? It's not for the television stations, it's for the advertisers, because the advertisers want to sell something to those audience members. Hegemony is also seen as a way for those who are in power to retain their dominant position. And so oftentimes what we observe in Western global media is a particular kind of programming that features a particular kind of character. And those characters often, the heroes are often white middle-aged males, are the ones who are also in power within these media conglomerates. And Finally, hegemony means that those who control the narrative or the stories that are being told by Western media are those who control the power. So if you're controlling the news stations, if you're controlling fiction stories about who the good guys and the bad guys are, then you continue to control power by reinforcing particular, let's say, cultural stereotypes or cultural norms. So that's the notion of hegemony. And if we apply this to Module 1, back to The Bachelor, then we can see that this very popular television show that has kind of taken off around the world does promote a particular kind of relationship, a particular kind of beauty, a particular kind of sexuality. And if it also suggests, who's visible and who's not visible. If you look a particular way, then this is a show that you are likely to be on. But if you don't, not only are you not likely to be on this show, you're not likely to be on any show. So how is The Bachelor in service of capitalism, if we are to go back to this concept of hegemony? How does it maintain power structures? That's a concept that these are two questions and concepts that I'd like you to think about and explore as you're reading the chapter and as you're thinking about some of the content that gets made here in the US and then disseminated around the world. A second concept is that of cultural imperialism. If we were to apply this to American media, then we would say our programs being shipped abroad, outside of North America, outside of Europe, but present in places like Asia and Africa, they are shaping the cultures and the identities of other nations, right? So American styles that are so prevalent in American media content that dominate many other environments, those styles in fashion, food, even media fare like music and musical taste, they tend to dominate the global market. Now, it's important to ask, why are countries inundated by American movies, American TV shows, American music? Why don't countries just kind of make it themselves? Well, making media content is expensive, and one has to have the infrastructure to create the content. One has to have funding and financing, and one has to be able to take some level of risk in creating content. And for many producers in countries that are developing, it's too tricky to produce, let's say, a full year's worth of TV shows, 26 to 50 episodes. And so having American media content available is one way for TV stations, for example, to fill up their day. And if they don't have enough local indigenous content, then they'll turn to other content to fill up the day. And then oftentimes when you look at the production values of American media content with locally produced media content, you can really see a distinction, because there just are fewer resources, less infrastructure to be able to make highly polished, very Western looking kinds of movies or TV shows. So as we think about hegemony and we think about cultural imperialism, we want to ask the question, well, who is visible and who is invisible in the modern audience? So in our next part 2 of Module 2, we'll be asking this question, and it will allow us to kind of set up for Module 3, where I have you reading Jordan and Prindella commentary about children's presence in and who's visible and who's invisible in children, adolescents, and media research.